Earth's ancient warship, the USS Endeavour, accelerated to attack speed, pointed directly at the heart of the massive Brunali invasion fleet. The Endeavour's fusion engines roared as the human crew pushed the antique ship to its limits, hurtling towards almost certain death. But the humans knew it was the only way. "Another round, Yaris, this story ain't finished." The grizzled war veteran Ethan Henry slid his empty glass across the dimly lit station bar to the wide-eyed young Brunali. Yaris quickly refilled it with the potent green liquid and leaned in, eager to hear more about the legendary Battle of Gliese 581. Ethan took a swig and continued. The year was 2257. Us humans were the new kids on the galactic block, young, dumb, and full of optimism about exploring the stars, but we got a hard reality check real fast. He fixed Yaris with a long stare. Your people, the Brunali, were waiting out there to cut us down. Your leaders saw our early colonies and figured we'd be easy prey to conquer and enslave. Ethan chuckled darkly. But they didn't know who they were fucking with. When the Brunali battleships jumped into our systems and started bombing human worlds, Earth cobbled together every ship we had to fight back. Yaris tentatively raised a hand. That's when the Endeavour rejoined the fleet, right? I thought she was just a museum ship by then, outdated by centuries. Ethan nodded. Endeavour was all that and more, kid. A relic from an age when humans were too busy killing each other to worry about aliens, but we needed every gun we could get. He gestured to the holographic star map on the bar wall, tracing a line from Earth to where the USS Endeavour was now charging the Brunali forces. See, the Brunali had us outgunned and outnumbered. Our modern ships were getting chewed up, so the Endeavour was our trump card, our last desperate roll of the dice. Ethan's eyes unfocused as he relived the memories. If that old warhorse couldn't punch a hole in the Brunali line for our remaining ships to exploit, the human colonies were finished. Earth might be next. Billions would die or be enslaved by aliens. He refocused on Yaris. Endeavour was flying into the jaws of hell, but she was crewed by the toughest sons of bitches in the galaxy, humans with nothing to lose. Ethan leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. The brass had cooked up a crazy plan, but it was our only shot. See, the Endeavour had a secret weapon, something the Brunali had never seen before. A magnetic accelerator cannon, or Mac gun for short. Yaris's eyes widened. A Mac gun? I've never heard of such a thing. Not surprised, kid. It was experimental tech, left over from the early days of human space travel. The thing was massive, running nearly the entire length of the ship. It used superpowered electromagnets to sling a chunk of tungsten at insane speeds, faster than any conventional weapon could manage. Ethan mimed the gun firing, his hand punching forward. The idea was that it could tear through the toughest armor like tissue paper, ripping ships apart with sheer kinetic force. But the brass didn't know if it would do squat against Brunali's shields. It had never been tested in real combat before. He took another swig of his drink, savoring the burn. So there we were, a skeleton crew on an antique warship, trying to bring her back from the dead in record time. We had veterans who remembered the Endeavour's glory days, working alongside fresh-faced recruits who'd never seen a ship without a holodeck. Ethan chuckled. I was a young buck myself, just out of engineering school. They put me in charge of the Mac gun, figuring I could keep the old girl running when the time came. His smile faded. We worked around the clock, barely sleeping, barely eating, jury-rigging parts, relearning old systems, praying the whole thing wouldn't shake itself apart when we fired the gun. We could feel the weight of it all, you know. The fate of the colonies, maybe even Earth herself resting on our shoulders. Yaris was leaning so far forward now that he was practically climbing over the bar. So what happened when the Brunali arrived? We intercepted them at the edge of the system, the Endeavour and a handful of newer ships against their whole damn armada. The plan was for us to play bait, to draw their fire and create an opening for the rest of the fleet to exploit. Ethan's gaze turned distant, his mind's eye filled with the swirling chaos of that fateful battle. It was a hell of a gamble, and we all knew it. But sometimes that's all you have in war, a desperate hope, and the courage to see it through. And so with alarms blaring and the enemy closing in, we charged headlong into the fire. Ethan downed his shot and slammed the glass to the bar. The battle replayed in his mind, each explosion and scream as real as the day it happened. Space lit up like hell itself as the Brunali opened fire. Plasma bolts and laser beams crisscrossed the void. Our shields took a pounding, barely holding together under the onslaught. But the Endeavour had thick armor and outdated shielding, built for slugging matches like this. She charged forward, fearless, drawing the brunt of the enemy barrage. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, veins popping. Our escort ships, tiny gnats next to Endeavour, darted around the edges of the furball, picking off Brunali fighters, probing for gaps in their defenses, anything to take some heat off us. He shook his head, eyes distant. Inside Endeavour it was chaos. Sirens wailed, bulkheads shook, sparks flew from overloaded consoles. The inertial dampeners struggled to compensate as the ship corkscrewed and juked, but we stayed on mission. Ethan mimed working the controls, fingers flying. I slaved the Mac capacitors, rerouting every scrap of power from engines and life support. The electromagnets hummed with ungodly charge. We zeroed in on a Brunali cruiser and let loose. Ethan's hand scythed down. The Mac round punched clean through their shields, through meters of armor, out the other side in a spray of molten steel. That cruiser came apart like a rag doll. He repeated the motion. Again and again we fired, tearing Brunali ships to shreds with pure kinetic hell. No shield could stop the Mac, no hull could withstand it. Ethan grimaced, but the Brunali wised up quick. They focused fire on our gun on the Endeavour's engine banks. We took hit after hit, Macs sluggish between salvos as damage mounted. Blast doors sealed across the ship as compartments depressurized. I thought we were finished. A savage grin split his face. Then our escorts found a chink in the Brunali's armor. They'd spied the enemy flagship, seen how its shields flickered as it poured power into weapons. The little ships pounced, strafing runs and torpedo volleys, concentrating on a single point. Ethan's hands clenched as if crushing something. They punched through and hit something critical. Power core, munitions bank, don't know. The Brunali flagship exploded like a newborn star. Shockwaves sent their formation into total disarray. He made a shooting motion, picking off imaginary targets. That was our chance. Endeavour and the escort surged into the gap, pouring fire into the milling ships. We swept their flanks, cut down stragglers. The Brunali line collapsed. The Endeavour shook violently, sparks erupting from overloaded power conduits as the Brunali assault intensified. Captain Nora Vance gripped the armrests of her command chair, knuckles white. "Divert all power to shields," she barked. "Keep that Mac gun firing." On the gun deck, Ethan worked furiously to keep the massive weapon operational. Sweat poured down his face as he rerouted power from failing systems. The Mac's barrel glowed cherry red, heat shimmers distorting the air. "Capacitors at critical levels," his assistant shouted over the din of battle. "One more shot and they'll blow." "Then make it count," Ethan growled. He aimed the Mac at a Brunali cruiser and fired. The tungsten round punched through the enemy ship's hull, gutting it stem to stern. But the Brunali kept coming. Plasma bolts hammered the Endeavour's failing shields. Consoles exploded across the bridge, showering the crew with sparks. "Hull breach on deck 5, an officer reported. "We're venting atmosphere." Nora clenched her jaw. "Seal it off, prep damage control teams." The ship groaned like a wounded beast, lights flickering. In the launch bays, pilots scrambled to their fighters, ready for one last desperate sortie. "All wings, launch," Nora ordered. "Buy us some time." The fighters swarmed out, lasers flashing as they engaged the Brunali ships at point-blank range. They wove through the enemy formation with daring skill, drawing fire away from the battered Endeavour. But it wasn't enough. The Brunali pressed their attack, sensing victory. The Endeavour's shields collapsed, exposing her scarred hull. "We've got boarders in the engine room," someone shouted over the comm. "They're trying to disable our core." Nora slammed a fist on her armrest. They couldn't hold out much longer. She opened her mouth to give the order to abandon ship. Suddenly space lit up with new contacts. A fleet of gleaming ships dropped out of hyperspace, energy weapons already firing as they entered the fray. "It's the Galactic Council," the sensor officer cried, voice thick with relief. "They're engaging the Brunali." The Council ships tore into the enemy fleet, advanced weapons cutting through their shields like paper. The Brunali, faced with this new threat, began to fall back, their formation crumbling. On the Endeavour's bridge, the crew erupted in ragged cheers. They had been seconds from destruction, and now salvation had arrived. But Nora held up a hand for silence, her eyes locked on the tactical display. The Brunali were regrouping, preparing for a counterattack. This fight was far from over. Ethan paused, taking a long pull from his drink. He glanced at Yaris, gauging the Brunali's reaction. The kid was hooked, leaning forward, his eyes wide with anticipation. "With the Council ships engaging the Brunali, we finally had a moment to breathe," Ethan continued. But the Endeavour was in bad shape. Sparks flew from ruptured conduits. The deck plates were slick with blood and coolant. We knew we couldn't keep fighting for much longer. The crew worked frantically to repair the most critical damage. Engineers in bulky EVA suits clambered over the hull, wielding plasma torches to seal breaches. Inside, damage control teams rerouted power, bypassing destroyed sections to keep the Mac gun and engines online. "We thought the Council would take over the fight," Ethan said. "But then we received a message from their flagship, Admiral Zorik himself, the Supreme Commander of the Council forces." Ethan sat up straighter, his voice taking on a note of pride. "Zorik said they wanted us to lead the charge. The Endeavour, the scrappy little human ship that had held the line against impossible odds. He wanted us to show the Brunali the strength and resilience of humanity." A fierce grin spread across Ethan's face. You should have seen the crew's reaction. Exhausted, bloodied, but filled with a renewed sense of purpose. We knew this was our chance to prove ourselves, to show the galaxy what we were made of. With fresh determination, the Endeavour and her battered escort ships formed up alongside the gleaming Council vessels. A ragtag fleet, united in purpose, ready to face the regrouping Brunali head-on. "We charged forward," Ethan said, his hand cutting through the air. The Endeavour at the tip of the spear, her Mac gun blazing. The Brunali threw everything they had at us, plasma torpedoes, particle beams, drone swarms, but we wouldn't be stopped. In a display of tactical brilliance and raw courage, the human ships and their Council allies broke through the Brunali lines. They targeted the enemy's command ships and supply vessels, striking at the heart of their fleet. "We hit them where it hurt," Ethan snarled, cutting off their reinforcements, sowing chaos in their ranks. The Endeavour's Mac rounds tore through their hulls. The Council's energy weapons sliced their shields apart. Under the combined onslaught, the Brunali formation crumbled. Ships scattered, some fleeing, others consumed by the hungry flames of ruptured reactors. The once mighty armada reduced to a shattered remnant. Ethan's hands clenched into fists as he recalled the Brunali dreadnought's sudden appearance. The behemoth emerged from behind the enemy lines, its hull bristling with massive cannons and thick armor plates. The dreadnought's beam weapons lanced out, searing through the void. The Endeavour shuddered as the beams sliced into her escort ships, cutting them apart in flashes of ruptured hulls and venting atmosphere. "Evasive maneuvers," Captain Vance shouted, gripping her chair's armrests as the bridge shook. "Focus fire on that dreadnought." The Endeavour's Mac gun thundered in response, the tungsten rounds streaking towards the massive Brunali vessel. But the dreadnought's shields flared, absorbing the shots with contemptuous ease. Ethan cursed, rerouting more power to the capacitors. "It's no good," he yelled over the din of battle. "We're not even scratching it." The Council ships fared no better, their advanced weaponry splashing harmlessly against the dreadnought's defences. The Brunali vessel ploughed forward, its relentless advance scattering the Allied fleet. Desperation gripped the crews as the dreadnought pushed them back, undoing their hard-fought gains. Consoles sparked and alarms blared aboard the Endeavour as the ship strained under the onslaught. "We're losing shields," an officer reported, her voice tight with fear. Hull breaches on decks 3 and 5. Captain Vance's jaw tightened. They were on the verge of defeat, their ships battered and allies falling back. The dreadnought filled the view screen, an unstoppable juggernaut. Suddenly the sensor officer's console lit up. "Captain, I'm detecting a fluctuation in the dreadnought's power systems," she called out. "There's a weakness in its shields near the aft section." Vance leaned forward, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Helm, bring us about. Ethan, target that weak spot with everything we've got." The Endeavour swung around, her engines flaring as she charged towards the dreadnought's exposed flank. The remaining Council ships fell in beside her, weapons primed. "Divert all power to the Mac gun," Ethan roared, his fingers flying over the controls. "Capacitors at maximum charge." The Mac gun hummed with power, the barrel glowing white-hot. The Endeavour and her allies fired as one, a brilliant lance of concentrated energy and tungsten rounds converging on the dreadnought's aft section. The Brunali vessel's shields flared, struggling to repel the onslaught. But the combined firepower was too much. The shields shattered, the Mac rounds and energy beams tearing into the dreadnought's hull. Secondary explosions rippled across the massive ship as the power core went critical. The dreadnought listed, flames gouting from its wounds. Then, in a blinding flash, it exploded. The shockwave slammed into the Endeavour, sending her spinning. Debris pinged off her hull, sparks erupting from overloaded systems, but she held together, the crew bracing against the impact. As the glare faded, the dreadnought was gone, reduced to an expanding cloud of molten fragments. A ragged cheer went up from the Endeavour's crew, echoed by their allies over the comms. As the shockwave from the dreadnought's destruction dissipated, Ethan saw the Brunali ships faltering, their formation crumbling. Some turned tail and fled, engines flaring as they sought to escape the system. Others, their weapons falling silent, broadcast surrender signals on all frequencies. "They're breaking!" someone shouted over the comm, voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief. Captain Vance leaned forward in her chair, eyes intent on the tactical display. "All ships, press the attack. Don't let them regroup." The Endeavour surged forward, her engines straining as she chased down the fleeing Brunali vessels. Her Mac gun fired again and again, each shot claiming another enemy ship. The Council vessels kept pace, their advanced weapons carving fiery paths through the void. Ethan watched the tactical display, his heart pounding as the Allied fleet tore through the Brunali ranks. Stragglers were quickly run down and dispatched, while those who surrendered were herded into tight clusters, their ships drifting powerless in space. As the last of the Brunali resistance faded, a sense of disbelief and elation swept through the Endeavour's battered corridors. Crew members cheered and embraced, tears of joy and relief mingling on their faces. "We did it," Ethan murmured, his voice raw with emotion. "We actually did it." On the bridge, Captain Vance sagged back in her chair, a weary smile on her face. "Stand down from battle stations," she ordered, her voice ringing with pride. "Begin damage assessment and repair protocols." As the crew set to work, messages began pouring in from the Council ships, their captains offering congratulations and praise for the Endeavour's valiant stand. Vance responded graciously, acknowledging their own critical role in the victory. Ethan looked around at his fellow crew members, seeing the exhaustion and triumph etched on every face. For a moment, the divisions between human and alien seemed to melt away, replaced by a sense of shared purpose and camaraderie. But even as they savoured their hard-fought victory, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The Endeavour and her crew had proven humanity's strength and resilience, but there would be other challenges to face, other enemies to confront. The journey was far from over, but for now they could bask in the glow of their triumph, knowing that they had earned their place in the annals of galactic history. Ethan leaned back in his seat, the weight of old memories heavy on his shoulders. Yaris listened intently, his drink forgotten on the bar top. The Council had chosen a neutral location for the negotiations, a space station orbiting a barren moon. Felt like walking into the lion's den, even with the Endeavour docked just outside. Ethan shook his head. remembering the tension that had permeated the ship during their journey. The crew had been on edge, unsure of what to expect from their former enemies. Captain Vance had called them together before they disembarked, her face lined with a mixture of determination and weariness. "I know this isn't easy for any of us," she had said, her voice carrying through the crowded mess hall. "We've lost friends and comrades to the Brunali. We've seen the devastation they can cause firsthand, but now we have a chance to ensure that no one else has to experience that kind of loss. We have a chance to build a better future, for ourselves and for the galaxy as a whole." Her words had struck a chord with the crew, tempering their apprehension with a sense of purpose. As they filed off the ship and into the station's sterile corridors, they held their heads high, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The negotiation chamber was a large circular room with a holographic display dominating the center. Representatives from the Council and the Brunali were already seated around the table, their faces a mix of guarded curiosity and open hostility. Ethan and his crewmates took their seats, the weight of their dress uniforms unfamiliar after so long in combat gear. Captain Vance sat at the head of the human delegation, her expression carefully neutral. "Let us begin," the council mediator said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "We are here to discuss the terms of a ceasefire and, hopefully, the foundations of a lasting peace between our peoples." The talks began haltingly, with each side presenting their grievances and demands. The Brunali spoke of the lives lost and the damage done to their worlds, while the humans countered with the unprovoked nature of the invasion and the cost of their own sacrifices. Hours turned into days as the negotiations dragged on, the delegates arguing over every point and counterpoint. Ethan found himself marveling at Captain Vance's patience and diplomatic skill, the way she navigated the complex web of political maneuvering and cultural differences. But even her steady hand couldn't erase the years of animosity and distrust between the two sides. Tempers flared, and accusations flew, threatening to derail the fragile progress they had made. It was during one such heated exchange that Ethan found himself speaking up, his voice cutting through the clamor. "Enough," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We've all suffered losses. We've all felt the pain of war. But if we let that pain define us, if we cling to our hatred and our desire for revenge, then we're no better than the monsters we claim to fight against." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Ethan took a deep breath, meeting the eyes of each delegate in turn. "We have a choice here, a chance to be something more than just soldiers and survivors. We can choose to be builders, to create something new and better from the ashes of our conflict." He gestured to the holographic display, where images of the Battle of Gliese 581 still lingered. The Endeavour and her crew fought alongside the Council to defeat the Brunali dreadnought. We put aside our differences and worked together because we knew that our survival depended on it, and now our future depends on us doing the same. Ethan's words seemed to hang in the air, a palpable force that drew the delegates together. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tenor of the negotiations began to shift. The humans and Brunali started to listen more than they argued, to seek common ground rather than differences. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension and disagreement, but as the days turned into weeks, a fragile trust began to take root, nurtured by the hard work and determination of those on both sides who dared to hope for a better future. Ethan watched as the final terms of the treaty took shape, a sense of pride and accomplishment swelling in his chest. They had done it, against all odds. They had found a way to turn the horrors of war into the promise of peace. As the delegates rose to sign the document, Captain Vance turned to Ethan, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "You did good, Henry," she said softly, using his last name as she always did. "I think maybe diplomacy suits you better than engineering." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't know about that, Captain, but I do know that this—" He gestured to the treaty, to the delegates shaking hands and exchanging tentative smiles. "This is what we fought for. This is what our friends died for. and I'll be damned if I let their sacrifice be in vain." Vance nodded, her eyes shining with a mix of pride and sorrow. "Amen to that, Henry, amen to that." Ethan glanced over at Yaris, who was listening with rapt attention. The young Brunali's eyes were wide with wonder, his expression a mix of awe and respect. "So that's how the war ended?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's how it ended," Ethan confirmed, draining the last of his drink, "with a handshake and a promise and a whole lot of hard work still ahead of us." Ethan leaned back, a distant look in his eyes as he recalled the turning point in the peace negotiations. The talks had dragged on for days, the human and Brunali delegations trading barbs and accusations across the negotiating table. Tempers were fraying, and it seemed that the fragile truce they had achieved might shatter at any moment. It was during a particularly heated exchange that Ethan noticed the Brunali delegate, an older warrior with a scarred face and piercing eyes, staring at him intently. As the session broke for a recess, the delegate approached Ethan, his posture stiff but not overtly hostile. "You were on the Endeavour, weren't you?" the Brunali asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "During the battle?" Ethan nodded warily, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I was, Chief Engineer." To Ethan's surprise, the Brunali extended his hand. Yaris, commander of the Dreadnought. Ethan's eyes widened, his mind flashing back to that fateful moment when the Endeavour's guns had torn through the Dreadnought's hull. He hesitated for a moment, then grasped Yaris's hand firmly. "I must admit," Yaris said, "I never expected to be shaking the hand of the man who destroyed my ship. But I also never expected to see a human vessel fight with such courage and skill. You and your crew, you earned my respect that day." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat, the unexpected praise catching him off guard. "Thank you, that means a lot coming from you." Yaris nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Come, walk with me, I think it's time we talked, soldier to soldier." As they strolled through the station's observation deck, the distant stars twinkling through the viewports, Ethan and Yaris began to share their stories. They spoke of battles fought and comrades lost, of the triumphs and tragedies that had shaped them as warriors and as men. Ethan found himself opening up to Yaris in a way he never thought possible, the old Brunali's gruff exterior giving way to a sharp wit and a keen understanding of the costs of war. They traded tales of their respective homeworlds, of the families and loved ones they had left behind to fight for their people. As they talked, Ethan realized that despite their differences, he and Yaris had far more in common than he had ever imagined. They were both soldiers, dedicated to their duty and their crews, fighting for a cause greater than themselves. Word of their unlikely friendship spread quickly through the delegations, and soon other members of both sides began to follow their example. In quiet corners and over shared meals, humans and Brunali began to connect on a personal level, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams for a future beyond the blood and sacrifice of war. It was a small thing, these tentative connections forged in the shadow of conflict, but it made a difference. As the negotiations resumed, Ethan could sense a change in the atmosphere. The hostility and mistrust that had once dominated the proceedings began to give way to a cautious optimism, a willingness to listen and to compromise. Progress was slow, and there were still moments of tension and disagreement. Old wounds and deeply held grievances could not be erased overnight. But with each passing day, each small step forward, Ethan could feel the groundwork for a lasting peace being laid. It was a peace built not on the threat of force or the balance of power, but on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. A recognition that, beneath the uniforms and the flags, they were all ultimately fighting for the same thing, a chance to build a better future for their people. As the final terms of the treaty began to take shape, Ethan found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with Yaris, two old soldiers united in their determination to see this fragile peace take root and grow. They had come so far from the fire and fury of battle to the quiet resolve of diplomacy. But they both knew that the real work was just beginning. Ethan's eyes glistened with unshed tears as he recounted the final days of the negotiations. The weight of the Endeavour's sacrifice hung heavy in the air, a reminder of the price they had paid for peace. We gathered on the observation deck, the entire crew, to watch as the Endeavour was towed to the decommissioning yard, Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion. Captain Vance gave a speech, thanking us for our service, for our courage. But I could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain we all felt. He described the solemn ceremony, the lowering of the flag, the playing of the anthem. The Endeavour, once a proud warrior, now a silent monument to the fallen. We knew it was the right thing to do, that it was a necessary step towards lasting peace, but that didn't make it any easier to watch her go. Ethan spoke of the signing of the treaty, the historic moment when human and Brunali leaders put their signatures to paper. There were handshakes and smiles, but also tears. We had achieved something great, but the cost had been high. He recalled the celebration that followed, a bittersweet affair filled with toasts to the fallen and promises of a better future. We drank to the memory of those we had lost, to the brave men and women who had given their lives so that we might have this chance at peace. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself standing beside Yaris, the two warriors united in their grief and their hope. We spoke of the future, of the challenges that lay ahead. We knew that the road to true understanding between our peoples would be long and difficult, but we also knew that we had taken the first step, that we had lit a candle in the darkness. Ethan's voice grew heavy with emotion as he spoke of the friends he had lost, the comrades who would never see the world they had helped to build. I carry them with me, always. Their courage, their sacrifice. They are the true heroes of this story, the ones who gave everything so that we might have a chance at peace. He drained his glass and stood, his gaze distant and filled with memories. I come here every year on the anniversary of the battle, to remember, to honor the fallen, and to remind myself of the promise we made, the promise to never stop striving for a better tomorrow. Ethan turned to leave, his steps heavy with the weight of the past, but as he reached the door he paused, looking back at Yaris. We must never forget, he said, his voice a solemn vow. But we must also never give up hope, for in the end it is hope that will light our way forward, hope that will guide us to a brighter future. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.